Welcome to another episode of Art Scene at SMC. And I'm here talking with Maria LaCreta, who will be exhibiting artwork here at Somerville Media Center throughout the month of May and into June. Yeah, so quite a long time. Welcome to you, Maria.
Thank you.
How are you doing?
I'm well, yeah, I'm glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Great. So yeah, we're excited again for seeing your art up on our art wall. How did you start making art? What's your process like? I know those are two different questions.
Yeah.
How did you start making art?
I think I really just always made art. I mean, I always drew. You know, I was always a kid that was sort of drawing on everything, phone books and scraps and anything. And so I think that was always sort of promoted by the adults in my life too. It was sort of like, oh, she's the artistic one, or she does this, and that kind of was a identity I grabbed a hold of very early on.
Yeah.
And you know, and then that just sort of, that's always been the major piece of my identity until I got to you know, the level of having a practice, like a daily practice, which is really like high school age. And then I was really supported and championed to go to art school. So that was kind of the path I took. And but yeah, it's always been, like, I really can't trace when or what happened. I remember being always very excited about materials, and you know, even if it was something that wasn't necessarily an art material, just kind of putting things together and making stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, you hear that a lot with artists, that they've just always done it their whole lives. Yeah. And usually it is drawing or painting, and then that leads to another practice as they get older and turn into adults.
And I think it's most accessible, right? Because it's always like, even with school or pens, and maybe part of that was also doodling and just kind of like finding play, elements of play and fun.
Totally. And then to my second question, what's your process like now? Do you have a studio? Do you work at home?
Yeah, no, I have a studio at Vernon Street, and I share a studio there. And I have for the last 5 years about I've been there, and before that I was at home, which didn't work so well for me. I kind of like to have that piece outside, you know, just because it's, for several reasons, it just works better for me. But I think part of my process is, you know, just, it's again about materials, and sort of, I recently just did an interview about this, so I'm sort of pulling from that a little bit, but it's you know, that I'm one of those people that really talks about, and I'm careful to sort of say conduit or something like that. Like, I don't want to have it sound hokey, or that, you know, it's coming from some other place, and maybe it is, but really it's just about sort of having a relationship to materials, feeling inspired. You know, sometimes it might be about a very specific subject matter that I'm thinking this is really important to me, and maybe I'll sketch something out, or maybe it's about materials first, you know, so it kind of jumps around in terms of which piece comes first, in terms of materials or planning, you know, what's happening in my life. You know, I'm a person that writes and journals and tries to keep a sketchbook, so I think just one way or another in the creative process, it's always, inspiration might come from a different pocket in that process. And really getting in the studio might look different depending, right? You might have something that, like, I need to work with this material, or have something sort of mapped out, and then it's about investigation. Does it work with, you know, this material, or does it need to not be painting? Does it need to be something else? And I also, that just kind of reminds me of the way that I was educated also, you know. I mean, I think people think you go to art school to learn how to make art, and you don't necessarily. Like, no one's teaching you how to really make your art. It might be about concepts or techniques or material, right? So I had a professor kind of early on tell me, you have to choose painting if you're going to paint, you know. So it's like, if you have an idea, what is the best means to get that idea across? So that's also something that stays with me in terms of jumping around with media and investigating that way, you know.
It sounds like you're very open as to like what the end result will be. Is it primarily painting that you stick with?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I have a background like with film and video from a long time ago
Right.
as a student, and I, you know, a lot of my work is informed by drawing, and that knack, you know, like just for lack of a better word, just kind of like I talked about my early life, you know, with drawing. I mean, it really sort of all stems from two-dimensional work, I think. So I identify as a painter always. I mean, painting is sort of the way that I think in images, but I also like to do different projects, you know, and sometimes that's a different medium.
So why don't we take a look at some of your art pieces and discuss them. So this is, would you call your work abstract? Would you call it
Yes.
figurative?
I
Yeah.
call it abstract.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes that gets debated, and people say, you know, I tell them that's sort of my umbrella term, right?
Yeah.
Is to say I'm an abstract painter, and then they'll say, well, this isn't, you know, some people disagree with that. Some people think, well, when I have figurative elements in there, it's sort of, well, it's figurative, you know, but it's sort of, I don't know. I mean, it's abstract painting.
And so, like, a work like this, in the process that you described, could you describe a little bit of the process of making this painting in particular, and kind of the forms that you came up with, and the colors that you've come up with?
Yeah, this is not like my expertise, right? This is maybe why I paint, but I think I mean, very directly that process was, this is sort of a transitional piece in terms of, I had just done a series, like a triptych, essentially, before this, and it was really leading me someplace. So a little bit of the background here is that I didn't always have time in the studio that I wanted, right? I was a single mom raising my daughter, and I always like kind of struggled with having my responsibilities as a parent and putting ample studio time in, you know, and so that being said, I had a number of years where I would start projects and they wouldn't necessarily get finished, or they would just be ongoing.
Right.
And so the luxury that I had, you know, as my daughter became an adult and I was in the studio more, was to really see things through and kind of like have pieces and bodies of work that were progressing in a direction that I could really notice, right? And I could really kind of take account of. So the previous few paintings before this, or I should say maybe the previous like 2 years or a year solid before this, was leading me in a direction, let's say. And so this piece was really about playing with spatial relationships, like trying to kind of develop something more than maybe that stem from what stems from drawing, and playing with color and form and all of the formal elements, you know. And so this was kind of, you know, I mean, you said doodle. It definitely comes from drawing, and my, I don't, you know, I'm trying to make this accessible to, like, I'm talking in art terms, I'm thinking like my repertoire, but my, you know, like what comes, for lack of better words, like vocabulary in painting, when
Right.
you have, as an artist, you know, sometimes there's a theme that whether you're realizing it or not, things pop up. And so that might be, as a writer, it might be language, right? It might be vocabulary or something. As a painter, it might be certain shapes or images that might reappear. And so for me, a lot of that is, it's just part of my language, like what, in terms of how I come up with the shapes and how I come up with form, but it's not necessarily pre-thought, you know. So that is very, it's very much about my relationship to the material again, you know, canvas shape, what oil stick I might pick up or paintbrush to start. And I kind of, and it is, when you say it doesn't, the end result isn't necessarily this very particular thing. it's about my relationship to the process and the
Right.
material, and tweaking that and being surprised by that along the way also, and then maybe going in another direction or a very specific direction as a result of what's happening.
Right. So not necessarily not letting spontaneity take over the process, but allowing for some of that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's like thinking and doing in the same moment, but maybe one is kind of allowed to take precedence in certain moments over the other. So it's kind of just going back and forth in terms of investigation and direction.
I know a lot of people do base a lot of their writings on
No.
dreams. People who keep dream diaries. Does that enter into your process at all?
No.
No.
Yeah. No. I mean, it's interesting to think about what makes it dreamlike. Like what is it that's sort of maybe fantastical, and maybe that's.
Yeah.
You could answer that. I'm
Right,
guessing
yeah.
it might be color.
It's color. It's an empty raft on a rocky ocean. It's those kind of bulbous cloud forms that are clearly clouds in the background, but then in the foreground they're more bulbous kind of abstract forms that could be or they're not necessarily, and then they also mimic the bulbous forms in the foreground, which have a different quality as they wrap around those building-like structures. So to me, and the fact that there's not a human form necessarily in this painting, it kind of leads me in my own assumptions to I tag on this kind of dreamlike
Yeah.
label onto it, which it isn't appropriate, as you say.
No, I mean, it's interesting to hear, and it's not, I mean, I'm not opposed to it. I'm also thinking about people saying they hate to hear other people's dreams. But this is, yeah,
That's
it's
funny.
not.
I just read that somewhere.
Did you?
Yeah.
I was some quote I just heard about, or maybe it was a movie or something. But just in terms of what you said about dreams, like I think it's very much about storytelling, right? Like this might be a more illustrative piece, which has so when I say illustrative, like maybe it's a little cartoony, right? Like
Right.
that kind of style is something that I'm not opposed to people making a direct link to in terms of cartooned, like rounded edges and bright colors and heavy outlines and things like that. And part of that, I mean, I think is me growing up in the 80s and cartooning maybe, or cartoons like being something I'm seeing everywhere. Maybe the dreamlike quality is also coming, or what you're, seeing is that is part of my experience, like my lived experience is all kind of bits of fodder for my work as an artist.
Yeah.
So it's pulling from memory maybe, or pulling from everything. I mean, I know that in terms of like theory and talking, it can be a little murky when people are saying, things are more spontaneous or organic, or they're coming from their lived experience. But I really am owning that recently, because I feel like that's when we're really connected to material and maybe even the moment, or present in our kind of flow state, or like creative process, then why not? Like, why can't that be a part of the process and the way you explain the process,
Right. Yeah, I feel like especially coming from an art school environment like you did and like I did, there's a pressure that you need to just go
formal,
deeper
yeah.
and deeper and deeper when it comes to explaining your process and yeah, as you say, you don't necessarily need to do that with a certain body of work.
And when you say deeper and deeper, you're saying more theoretical
More
or
theoretical,
more like
yeah.
conceptual, yeah.
Yeah, more theoretical, I guess, especially if you want to go on to a career in grad school, where that even becomes more of what you need to do is defend your work, essentially.
Right.
But,
Yeah,
you know.
that was I lived in that world and that mindset, you know, I mean, the funny thing is, like, because I had my daughter younger and I didn't really have professional time in that world, let's say, like I didn't have that just wasn't my trajectory or whatever, you know, from undergrad. But I taught for 15 years, you know, and I just really, there's a part of me that that's another part of my language, right? And I can talk about that and I can understand those concepts, and I think they're valid in terms of us identifying influence and whose shoulders we stand on and all of that. But there's also a part of me that's just like, oh my God, like I just want to kind of talk to the artists now. You know, when I was younger, I used to like buzz through museums, buzz through galleries, and like that, don't like that. I never read anything, you know, it was like, I don't need to read anything. It's about the image and what I'm reacting to. Now I'm like, I read everything. Any opportunity I have to speak to the artist, I speak to the artist, because it really changes my perception of how I react to the work when I actually speak to the artist.
Yeah.
And it can kind of make or break my, you know, the way you find affinity with a piece, because it's so integral to any creative process, who's making it and what's their motivation.
Right.
So I think for me, I kind of have divorced away from the more theoretical, conceptual world and thinking it's not always the most, for me, important piece.
Yeah. I absolutely, I'm right there with you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Not that you have to be, but it's,
Yeah, that experiencing the work and first impressions are great, and then often if I'm curious enough about a work, it's not really about like or dislike, but if I'm curious enough about a work, I'll go back to it.
Right.
And then, I'll read about it, and if possible, I'll talk to the artist about it, like just like you're describing. It's all part of. I came across something that described art museums as like places, idea reservoirs. Then that's not exactly what they call them, but essentially you're going from one idea to another, and you know, it's just a space for ideas, and I like that.
Really
I like that attitude about museums. It kind of really turned me around. I was having kind of a love-hate relationship with museums that was a little more on the hate side, and now, you know, I'm open to all of it. Yeah,
that makes a lot of sense with the idea, one idea to another. I like that.
Is there anything else that you'd like to add about your show, your upcoming show here, or anything like that?
I'm excited. It's funny because I think I told you when I came in that I've been like sort of dancing around this place for 20 years.
Yeah.
So it's like when I lived here a while back, you know, it was always like I need to get involved there, and I was more into what I was doing with film and video. So it's nice to be here, to have the work up, and I hope, you know, I hope people come to experience it.
Yeah, we
see
hope
what you're
so
doing
too.
here. People that are more curious about it, like I was, get in here earlier than 20 years later.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. So the Maria LaCreta's work will be on display from May 20th through June 27th. That's a long time, so we hope you're able to come down and see that in that window. We're also having an art opening on May 24th, and we'll have more information about that after the show. So thank you again, Maria, and we're really looking forward to your show.
Thanks. Me too.